Well, hello everyone. It's week 11 in History 131. I'd like to say a few things about things you'll be watching and reading about and thinking about this week in the course. I'll kick things off, though, with a song, just like we would do if we were meeting face to face.
Something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, watch that sound. Everybody look what's going down.
You know the song as For What It's Worth by Stephen Stills. He wrote it in late December 1966 when he was appearing with a band called the Buffalo Springfield. They were the house band at a famous nightclub in Hollywood called Whiskey A Go-Go. Whiskey A Go-Go was with a bunch of other nightclubs on the Sunset Strip. In all fall, young people had been in the streets protesting decisions by the city council to try to impose a curfew on the nightclubs at 10 p.m. One evening, Stills heard a commotion outside the Whiskey A Go-Go, and when he walked into the street, he was surprised by what he saw. He saw Hell's Angels biker gangs standing side by side with clean-cut looking men and women from fraternities and sororities at the University of Southern California. He saw civil rights activists who in 1966 weren't much interested in hanging out with white people. He saw them standing next to anti-white, anti-war protesters, who'd come to the Sunset Strip from a protest march. And they were all side by side in opposition to the police who were trying to execute the curfew. Stills walked back inside his bar and sat down and wrote the words to this song. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. For a long time, it wasn't clear what was going on in America's 1960s. The first historians who wrote about the era portrayed the 1960s as a radical era, a time when young people became fed up with the strict codes of behavior enforced by their elder generation and rebelled against them in protest marches in the street, such as Stills is writing about in this song. Later historians, though, rewrote that history, and they no longer think about the 60s as a radical era. Instead, we think of it as a polarized era, where America, somewhere in the 60s, fell apart into two camps. Today we call these two camps the Blue Staters and the Red Staters. I bet you're familiar with county electoral maps like this one that show how counties in America voted in the most recent presidential election. This map comes from 2016. The red counties voted for Donald Trump and the blue counties voted for Hillary Clinton. And you can gauge the margin of victory by how red or how blue the county is. If you look at this kind of a map, the county map, it would appear that most of America belongs to the red state camp. But that's misleading. And most of these counties that voted for Trump in 2016 are rural areas that don't have very many people in them. And so other map makers have tried to come up with maps that are visually are more accurate for the polarized divide that America has been in since the 1960s. Here's another way to portray the red state, blue state divide. It shows that blue state people tend to live in urban areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Miami, Chicago, Houston. And the country's rural areas are predominantly red staters, conservatives who voted for Trump in the last election. Blue state, red state. It's how we've come to think of a divided America in the last 25 to 30 years. The first meme I think I ever saw was a meme illustrating the division between blue staters and red staters. I saw this meme in 2000, right after the Bush-Gore election. And the maker of the meme pictured the countries divided between the United States of liberty and education and the rest of the country labeled Jesus land. So you could see that probably, undoubtedly, the maker of this map belonged to the blue state side of things. The meme has mutated over the years. Here it is after the 2004 election between George Bush and John Kerry. Now we have Jesus land and the United States of Canada. It was in 2004 that for the first time many liberal-minded blue staters began joking among themselves that they wanted to move to Canada where they could have universal health insurance and supposedly liberation from Fox News. Here is another red state, blue state meme that pictures the countries divided between the smart, intelligent, normal people, and you can see they mostly live on the coasts or in the upper Midwest where we are, and the rest of the Americans who are inbred, redneck, religious wackos in Jesus land. The red state, blue state divide has just gotten worse over the years, and the meme reflects that too. This is from our last 2016 election, and it pictures the countries divided between the real America and dumb Fuckistan, where all the ignorant, racist wackos live. The two sides don't like each other very much. I know this from just paying attention to my social media feed in Twitter and on Facebook. I've got red staters, mostly from my high school years, who I've kept up with, and a lot of blue staters posting on my feeds, mostly college professors that I've gotten to know in my life as a professor. My high school friends, who mostly voted for Trump in 2016, they look at my college professor friends and they think of them as godless, unpatriotic, as Pierce-nosed, Prius-driving, France-loving, left-wing, communist, latte-sucking, tofu-chomping, holistic, wacko, neurotic, vegan, weenie perverts. That's pretty much how they talk about them on Facebook. Meanwhile, my college professor friends, they're not any less polarized. They look at my high school friends and the kind of things they post on Facebook, and they think of these red state residents as ignorant, racist, fascist, knuckle-dragging, NASCAR-obsessed, cousin-marrying, roadkill-eating, tobacco juice-dribbling, gun-fondling, religious fanatic rednecks. Like I said, the two sides don't like each other very much. How did we become so divided? There was a time when I thought the division was behind us and that we wouldn't have to talk about the culture wars anymore. Barack Obama was the first candidate in a long, long time to run a presidential campaign while refusing to use culture war memes, metaphors, and tropes. And so in 2008, I was telling students that the culture wars were over and that the people who'd come after us baby boomers, the millennials, were now leading us out of the culture wars, along with President Obama. A lot of people thought that, and we couldn't have been more wrong. The culture wars did not end during the Obama years. They actually got worse. And now, in a time of coronavirus, everybody has become aware of how polarized and divided the country has been, because it's pretty clear that what kind of state you live in or what kind of county you live in, whether it's red or blue, matters for how people are responding to the global pandemic. In this graph published in the New York Times, you can see that people living in Democratic counties were much more likely to be extremely concerned about the coronavirus outbreak than those who were living in red state counties. And just this past weekend, we saw in red states around the country protests by red staters against state-enforced quarantine regulations. We're as polarized as the country has ever been, as polarized as we were in 1776 on the cusp of a revolutionary war, as polarized as we were in the 1850s as the country lurched and reeled its way toward civil war. In the 1960s, and even in the 1970s, the parties largely overlapped each other, and there wasn't that much difference between them. In 1975, for example, you could find Democrats who opposed abortion as likely as you found Republicans who opposed it. But that's no longer the case, as this graph, also from the New York Times, shows. Since 1994, the two parties have drifted farther and farther apart in terms of policies like their stance on abortion, and in terms of their values that they hold dear. And it shows up among students, too. This chart shows differences in political opinions among the entering first-year class, data that we've tracked every year since the 1950s. The column on the left shows women's political identification, and the column on the right shows how men line up. And what this graph shows is that people who think of themselves as being in the middle of the road politically, have been declining since the 1980s. So college students are more polarized today than they have been at any time that pollsters have been asking them about their political opinions. The culture war isn't going away, it's just getting worse, and the coronavirus has exposed that in a big way. So, here I am, stuck in the culture wars with you as we begin this unit on the 1960s. And I think this makes a good question to have in mind as you watch your film and as you read Jill Lepore and Howard Zinn this week. What happened in the 1960s to break the country apart? How did it come about that the United States went from being a relatively homogeneous and unified society in the 1950s to today's red states and blue states? That's a question I recommend you have as you go this week to interact with the film In a Dark Time and to read the chapters on the 1960s in Jill Lepore and Howard Zinn. When you go to watch the film In a Dark Time, a couple of things to know. This 1-hour video is part 4 of a 6-part video examining the 1960s. And In a Dark Time narrows its focus to one single year, 1968, which I and other historians believe was the crucial moment when the United States pretty much broke in two. The film is online, courtesy of the man who made the film. So he's posted it online in 2 parts, 2 30-minute parts. So don't quit watching when the first 30-minute part ends. YouTube should kick that video over and start the second 30-minute part automatically. If it doesn't, you'll have to do some clicking to make that happen. But you should be able to watch 2 30-minute parts to the movie and see the whole thing. I think that's all I need to say about the film. As for Lepore and Zinn, we'll follow the usual routine we've established now with the quiz on the main point of those readings beginning Friday at noon and running Sunday to midnight. Our unit on the 60s will continue into next week because Zen and Lepore have more readings about what happened after the 60s that we're going to read. This unit's called the Long Sixties because it's my view that we're still in the 1960s in the sense that the culture war that opened up in 1968 or thereabouts is still with us. And so the 1960s never really ended, actually, and we're still living in that time, and I and some other historians call that the long 1960s. Well, that's all for now. Hope you enjoy this week's readings, and as always, I'm just an email or a Google Meet away if you have questions about or thoughts you want to share about the reading. Bye for now.